Trump unbowed and unrepentant, and a Republican Party in crisis tonight. After a brutal debate in which politics couldn't stoop much lower, their scandal-plagued candidate fought for his survival after being recorded bragging of sexual assault.
I'm very embarrassed by it. I hate it, but it's locker room talk.
I think it's clear to anyone who heard it that it represents exactly who he is.
Tonight, key Republicans are discussing what they can salvage from a potential electoral disaster. Also on News at 10. No vote on Brexit negotiations. The government's stark warning for MPs looking for a say. Searching for answers, the mental health failings which led to the death of a young father.
If someone who's so mentally unfit, how could they be allowed to be at liberty to walk around with knives?
And Wayne's World Cup dreams on hold as he's put on the bench for tomorrow's game.
This is ITV News at 10 with Julie Etchingham.
Good evening. It seems hard to believe that in the land of George Washington, those aiming to occupy the same great office of president traded some pretty deplorable insults last night. Most, it had to be said, came from Donald Trump. Today, in the aftermath of round 2 of Trump versus Clinton and that recording of his lewd remarks about women, Mr. Trump's party is fracturing further. Senior Republican figures are now letting it be known they will not campaign with him, and that with less than a month to go and Hillary Clinton nudging into a double-digit lead in the opinion polls.
Did anybody see that debate last night?
It was certainly an extraordinary hour and a half.
Well, you never saw anything like that before.
That is almost certainly true for all Americans. As Mrs. Clinton campaigned a short time ago in Michigan, voters are left to take stock of the most tumultuous debate anyone here can remember. But at a Trump rally in Pennsylvania tonight, a familiar chant. Lock her up, echoing around the venue. The candidate claiming he was the clear victor in the debate. The opening seconds last night gave us a clue to the ugliness that was to come. A smile and a greeting just about.
Hello.
But for the first time ever in a presidential debate, not even a suggestion of a handshake. Donald Trump immediately was asked about his boasting of sexual advances, even assaults, which threatens to destroy his candidacy.
And yes, I'm very embarrassed by it. I hate it, but it's locker room talk, and it's one of those things.
So this is who Donald Trump is. And the question for us, the question our country must answer, is that this is not who we are.
But then Trump took this campaign and this debate into uncharted territory. With a number of women sitting in the audience who accused Bill Clinton of sexual assault, they had been invited by Trump. The Republican then launched his scorched earth policy.
There's never been anybody in the history of politics in this nation that's been so abusive to women. What President Clinton did, he was impeached, he lost his license to practice law, he had to pay an $850,000 fine to one of the women.
At times, Mrs. Clinton simply had to absorb the blows of Trump's aggressive attacks.
You delete 33,000 emails, and then you acid wash them, or bleach them, as you would say, a very expensive process. So we're going to get a special prosecutor, and we're going to look into it, because you know what? People have been, their lives have been destroyed for doing 1/5 of what you've done, and it's a disgrace. And honestly, you ought to be ashamed of yourself.
And if you think that only in dictatorships and failing states that there is talk of throwing your opponent in prison, well, listen to this.
It's just awfully good that someone with the temperament of Donald Trump is not in charge of the law in our country.
Yeah, because you'd be in jail.
Secretary Clinton.
Mrs. Clinton accused Russia of hacking into politically sensitive websites, suggesting Trump would be the beneficiary.
We have never in the history of our country been in a situation where an adversary, a foreign power, is working so hard to influence the outcome of the election. And believe me, they're not doing it to get me elected. They're doing it to try to influence the election for Donald Trump.
But after 90 minutes of brutal attack and counterattack, in response to a question from the audience, a final surprise. Praise for each other.
I respect his children. His children are incredibly able and devoted, and I think that says a lot about Donald.
I will say this about Hillary. She doesn't quit. She doesn't give up. I respect that.
Afterwards, in the spin room next door, both sides recognized that this debate was something of a national embarrassment.
We've never been this low before. It's it's unnecessary, it's unkind, and it is a supreme diversion. Why are you asking about it? Because it's a diversion.
Does it in any way sadden you that American politics is now at this level?
Of course, it should sadden anybody that we're at this level. But it doesn't mean that we can't get better again.
Does it not feel like a banana republic when one candidate is threatening the other with jail time?
No one is threatening someone with jail time. They are saying that justice should be done. Why should the Clintons be above the law?
The candidates did manage a brief handshake at the end. Trump is severely damaged by that leaked tape, but now it appears he has survived to fight on for the final 30 days. Robert Moore, News at 10, St. Louis.
So let's take a look at what Mrs. Clinton and Mr. Trump actually talked about. The debate itself lasted 90 minutes, but almost half an hour of the debate was spent away from what they do as president, instead discussing issues like Trump's taped comments and his allegations against Bill Clinton, along with how much he pays in taxes, and, of course, on Hillary Clinton's emails and whether she has been honest with voters. The economy was barely mentioned, despite most Americans highlighting it as the most important policy area when it comes to deciding who to vote for. The focus instead falling on national security and immigration, foreign policy and healthcare. What matters now, of course, is how all that plays out in that handful of states which actually decide the result, the so-called swing states that neither candidate can afford to lose. The biggest of those is Florida, and both are heading there tomorrow.
November 8th is election day, but you can start early voting October 24th.
This extraordinary election is finally stumbling towards a conclusion, and in swing states like Florida, the race is on for every vote. Neither party has a clear lead here, so small margins make a big difference, and a scandal can crush a candidate's hopes.
I think people with mothers and daughters and sisters will have second thoughts about Trump. And I think it's a good time for women to stand up for their rights. I mean, this is a very galvanizing election, so maybe a lot of good will come out of it.
But Trump's core support is still strong, and his performance last night delighted them. We watched the debate with a campaign group in Miami. There were more women than men in the room. The sleaze and the scandals haven't dampened their admiration for him one bit. Quite the opposite, in fact.
Our next president, yes, sir.
What about the scandals? What about the things he said about women?
Are you kidding? He loves women. He loves women.
It shouldn't have been said, but I mean, you know, I go beyond that. I try not to look at that too much and focus on the important things.
Who's going to win this election?
Trump.
Despite the scandals?
I think it helps him.
Let's see what you think, South Florida.
Unedifying it may have been, but the debate has certainly got the country talking.
See, are you going to interrupt me now?
This campaign has divided America, and there's a fear that ill-tempered radio phone-ins may just be the start.
I think the great question of this election is, will the American people accept the legitimacy of the election result, whether they agree with the outcome or not, or whether their candidate won or not? And right now, especially listening to some of the folks on this program, I'm not so sure, and I think that's a great danger to our American system.
Both candidates will bring their campaigns here to Florida tomorrow. In this swing state and beyond, there are crucial days ahead. Martin Geisler, News at 10, Miami.
Well, let's return now to St. Louis and Robert Moore, who's there for us this evening. Well, the Republicans have got themselves into this mess, Robert, by choosing Trump as their candidate. What are they now trying to do to ensure their survival?
Well, it's not an exaggeration to say, Julie, this is almost a kind of existential crisis for the Republican Party. It is in danger tonight of fracturing. For example, the most senior elected Republican in the country, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Paul Ryan, has said in private conversations he will no longer be making joint appearances with Donald Trump. And he is advising Republican congressional candidates to do anything they can to save their seats. And it would include distancing themselves from Donald Trump and his rhetoric. So it is the working assumption now of sort of Republican elites that the White House is lost. And now it's about trying to save their majorities in the Senate and in the House, and by extension, trying to shape in the future the Supreme Court. So it's really no longer about 2016, it's about 2020 and beyond, the whole restructuring of the Republican Party. Those sort of hyper-aggressive and controversial tactics by Donald Trump last night may have kind of enthralled and exhilarated his supporters, but they also repelled the very votes he needs from women and moderate voters. And to add to the whole thing, there are rumours tonight that there may be additional damaging revelations about Donald Trump from his show business days.
It'll keep you busy, Robert, that's for sure. Thank you very much indeed for that. Well, to politics back here now, and the slightly less vitriolic arguments over Brexit. And the government has made clear that MPs won't get to vote on how it handles the negotiations for leaving. A campaign is growing at Westminster for Parliament to have a say on keeping Britain's membership of the European single market.
Redrawing this place, the Houses of Parliament to take back power from Brussels. That, for many, was the whole point of leaving the European Union. But on our future trading relationship with Europe, so important to how rich we are, the Prime Minister confirmed today that MPs won't get a vote. And a recent Deputy Prime Minister says that's a bad joke.
There's a world of difference between leaving the European Union and leaving the single market, or leaving the European Union but trying to retain as much membership of the single market as possible. And since the Brexiteers never bothered to explain that to us before the 23rd of June, I think it's right that people's representatives should be able to debate and vote on that in Parliament now.
In fact, in this assertion of MPs' rights to say what Brexit actually means, it looks as though the pro-EU band is being put back together.
As someone who for many years railed about the importance of the powers of backbenchers and Parliament against the executive, can he give us now with a straight face an answer to the question, where is the government's mandate for its negotiations, either from this House or the country?
I really cannot believe my ears. Here we have the largest mandate this country has ever given to a government on any subject in our history. It's very plain. It's very plain.
Those MPs like Clegg and Miliband who seek greater access to Europe's single market than the Prime Minister is prepared to promise have formed an alliance with much of big business, and they'd all willingly pay the price of relatively higher levels of immigration. Do you think the Prime Minister has been making enough of a case for the positive benefits of immigration?
I think we have failed in this country to have an honest conversation about the positive contribution that employees from outside the UK play to so many vital parts of our economy, not just to business, but also to the public sector. And I think for many years we haven't talked about this. And in my view, they play an absolutely vital contribution, a valuable contribution, and we should be proud of them. We shouldn't be ashamed about the fact we have diverse workforces.
But when visiting Europe's leaders, the Dutch PM today, to negotiate Brexit,
my new British colleague, I'm so happy to see you.
She wants maximum freedom, so MPs will get their vote only when the deed and deal is done in more than 2 years. Robert Peston, News at 10.
Well, we'll stay with Brexit, and anyone planning a holiday or business trip abroad and watching the exchange rates has seen the pound take a pounding recently, and the fall continue today. Now, at some airport bureau de change, if it is the euro you're after, you only get 88 cents to the pound. Well, our business editor, Joel Hills, is here. It's pretty much the worst exchange rate you've seen in years, Joel, fair assessment?
This is proof that if you are heading abroad, the airport is probably the worst place in the world to change your money. Companies are pocketing breathtaking commissions. Let's have a a look on the financial markets, because what we can see is that the pound has devalued quite significantly since the referendum on the 23rd of June, by around 15%. Sterling fell a little against the euro today. £1 in theory buys you €1.10. Fell slightly against the dollar as well. £1 in theory buys you $1.23. But that survey shows that at the Bureau de Change of 16 airports, on average, you were getting less than €1 for every pound you were changing. We can look at the worst offenders here. They were Southampton, they were Stansted, and they were Southend, as you can see there. Yeah, passengers there, particularly grieved. Have we seen these before? Yes, we have, 8 years ago. The difference being in 2008, we were heading into recession, and so far, post-referendum, the economy's held up.
And it's not always bad news for everyone.
It's not. In theory, it makes our exports more attractive. One of the problems we've had, Julie, is that as a nation, we have been buying more from the rest of the world for years, decades, than we have selling to the rest of the world. We have been living beyond our means. So the slump in the pound is an opportunity to rebalance. It didn't happen in 2008. It may happen now in the medium term. In the short term, the pound in our pocket buys us less. We as a nation are poorer.
Okay, John, thank you very much indeed for that. Now, the bombing of a funeral wake in Yemen on Saturday was one of the deadliest incidents in 18 months of attacks by a Saudi-led coalition on Yemeni rebels. More than 140 mourners were killed. Today, the head of the United Nations said there should be an investigation into that attack, but blamed the Saudi-led coalition for what he called immense carnage during the course of the conflict. Today, there was another big funeral, one of many, for Saturday's victims.
They're burying the dead in Sana'a. Dozens of burials for those killed in this weekend's funeral attack. On the streets, thousands came to mourn the capital's governor, his picture looking down on his own procession. The governor was one of hundreds of people packed into the funeral hall when it was hit by a Saudi-led coalition airstrike.
They don't have the right to bomb us every day. They think us that we are some kind of uneducated people, unlearned people. Kill 100, kill 1,000, it will not matter. It matters.
Officials say at least 140 people were killed and hundreds more injured when the bombs fell on this funeral hall on Saturday afternoon. The Saudi-led coalition says it will now investigate. But today, even as the mourners paid their respects to the governor's family, the jets were back again, their roar heard overhead. As Sana'a buries its dead, there's rising anger here at the weekend funeral attack, and with it, calls for revenge. Hopes for peace here have never seemed so far away.
It means to us war with Saudi. We need no talk. We need war. We will kill or be killed. That's for us. Blood for blood and iron for iron.
Yemen's tragedy has a new chapter. The single deadliest attack in its 19-month war. In the capital, as they cover the graves of its victims, how many more will follow? Neil Connery, News at 10, Sana'a.
Well, as Neil was saying, that war in Yemen has been raging for 19 months now and appears to be getting deadlier by the week. It began in March last year when the Houthi rebels forced President Hadi to flee the capital Sana'a. Since then, more than 4,000 civilians have been killed at a rate that is rapidly increasing. In the first 10 days of this month alone, 369 civilians have died. And there is a growing humanitarian crisis there, with 1.5 million malnourished children in the country. Well, Neil is still in Sana'a tonight, and a lot of developments today, Neil, not least a shift in the British position in terms of its relationship with the Saudis.
Well, Foreign Office sources are telling News at 10 that they want this Saudi investigation into what happened at the weekend to be fast, credible and not a whitewash. Now, what they're saying here is that if that is not the case, then the UK government could review
its arms export policy to Saudi Arabia. That clearly sounds like a hardening of the position of the British government. Of course, the United Nations and human rights groups have long called for the need for an independent and thorough investigation into incidents like this in Yemen. The real test of all of this is going to be when the Saudi-led coalition reports back on this incident. At that point, what does the British government do?
And we should mention too, really, Neil, and you will have witnessed this on the ground, that whatever the horror, terrible horror of these attacks that we've seen over the last few weeks, it really happens against a backdrop of the most devastating humanitarian crisis in that country.
Absolutely, Julie. I was here back in March, and the situation was desperate enough then. It has deteriorated rapidly since then. At least 10,000 people have lost their lives as a result of this war. I think that is actually a conservative estimate. More than 3 million people forced from their homes. 80% of the population of Yemen is dependent on humanitarian aid, and severe malnutrition now a growing problem in this country. The scale of the crisis facing this nation is difficult to comprehend. What is clear is that the world is running out of time to respond to it.
OK, Neil, thank you very much indeed for that. It should have been the happiest time of Dr. Jeroen Ensink's life. He had just become a father, but as he walked across the road from his home to the letterbox to post cards announcing his daughter's birth, he was stabbed to death by a mentally ill man who'd got hold of some knives. Today, that man, who had admitted manslaughter, was sent by a judge to a secure hospital. Dr. Ensink's widow said the killer should never have been on the streets, let alone with a knife. Whoever allowed that to happen should be held accountable.
Dr. Jeroen Ensink was killed just 11 days after becoming a father for the first time. He'd been on his way to post cards telling friends and family about the birth of his baby daughter. A daughter, his widow says, he'll now never know.
He had the biggest heart. He was such a good man.
Femi Nandap admitted killing Dr. Ensink. He had mental health problems, including paranoid schizophrenia. But Dr. Ensink's family believe it was the authorities who failed them. In May 2015, Nandap was charged with carrying knives and assaulting a police officer. He then breached his bail conditions and flew to Nigeria. His sister wrote to the police saying he was suffering depression and psychosis and couldn't travel back to the UK. After he returned, and just before Christmas, all charges against him were dropped due to insufficient evidence, despite his family telling the police of his mental illness. 6 days later, he killed Dr. Ensink.
My big question from the very beginning is, how could this have ever happened? If someone who's so mentally unfit, how could they be allowed to be at liberty to walk around with knives?
It was here, just a few yards from his home, that Dr. Ensink encountered Nandap, who'd approached him wielding a large kitchen knife. He had bare feet, and the court was told that he heard voices in his head telling him to kill. He then repeatedly stabbed the university academic.
The Crown Prosecution Service say even if the charges weren't dropped, it may not have saved Dr. Ensink's life. But campaigners supporting his family are calling for an investigation.
This case raises serious questions, and we are calling for an independent multi-agency inquiry into what has happened in this case and why a dangerous man could be at liberty on the day he killed Mr. Ensink.
Jeroen Ensink was an internationally respected water and sanitation expert who dedicated his work to improving the lives of the world's poor. His loss is felt not just by his family, but also by the thousands of people he'd pledged to help. Sejal Karia, News at 10.
As our reporting last week of Aleppo under siege made clear, reporting from Syria has never been more important. Yet an award-winning Syrian journalist is claiming the British government, at least the Home Office anyway, is silencing her by keeping hold of her passport. The Syrian authorities claimed Zeina Ahem's passport had been stolen. She told us she has lost faith in the UK as a protector of freedom of expression.
They are images that have come to define the war in Syria. But many of those risking death to bring them to us were trained and inspired by a Syrian journalist who now feels undermined by the British government.
The winner is
Zaina Ahaim from Syria.
Zaina Ahaim has won awards for her activism and mentoring of other journalists in Aleppo. Yet on arriving at Heathrow last month, one of her 2 Syrian passports was confiscated by a British Border Force official who said it had been reported stolen by the Syrian regime.
I was really scared and I asked myself, would they deport me back to Damascus? What should I do?
Luckily, she was able to enter Britain using her second Syrian passport. But because it's completely full, there's no space for a new British visa. Hers expires next month.
What exactly the regime wants is shushing all those who are daring to criticize it in the international platforms.
It's an attempt to silence you.
It is, and he is winning thanks to the British government.
In a statement, the Home Office said our first priority is the security of our borders and it would be irresponsible to ignore warnings about lost or stolen passports. The British government has no direct contact with the Assad regime due to the atrocities it has committed against the Syrian people. Amnesty says other Syrian activists have also had passports confiscated abroad, but Zaina's is the first case in Britain.
Well, the UK government has found itself in an incredibly embarrassing situation where they're essentially being used by the murderous Assad regime to persecute one of Syria's leading human rights activists.
Has this shaken your faith in Britain?
There is no faith at all, no faith is left.
Tonight, the Home Office told us it is looking into the details of her case. For now, Zaina and her baby daughter remain in limbo. But Zaina is determined to continue highlighting the repression of President Assad's regime, with or without the British government's help. Dan Rivers, News at 10.
Armchair England football fans will ultimately judge if it's the right decision, but the team's interim manager, Gareth Southgate, has already made his mark before his second game in charge. He's dropped the England captain, Wayne Rooney. He'll only be a substitute for tomorrow night's World Cup qualifier in Slovenia. So is Rooney's England career now officially on the wane?
If there is any tension between Gareth Southgate and Wayne Rooney, it wasn't obvious this evening. Rooney was even given the option, insisted on facing the media.
I understand and respect the manager's decision, and I'll support the players 100% and try and help the players get 3 points tomorrow. So I'll be ready, of course, to come on from the bench if needed.
Southgate said the call to drop England's record breaker was purely pragmatic.
Of course, not an easy decision to take because of the respect I have for him as a player, as a person, as a captain of this team. But we felt it was the right decision to go with the team that we're starting with.
12 years ago, Southgate played alongside Rooney at the start of his England career. A career, Rooney says, still has a long way to run.
There's no embarrassment. I show great pride in playing for my country. And whether that's from the bench, then that's from the bench. Nothing has changed in terms of my future over the next couple of years.
But ultimately, of course, that will not be a decision for him.
So everybody will be talking about it. Is this the beginning of the end for Wayne, do you think?
Julie, I think the answer is yes, but I think we could be in for a long goodbye. He's 30 years old now. He's been playing football non-stop, club and country, for the last, 13 years or so. But the last 3 games, he hasn't been in Manchester United's starting lineup, and he was always the first name on England's team sheet, and now he's starting on the bench. He's also getting used to a new position, one in which he didn't make his name. But the facts are, he hasn't been in the best of form, and he's just not as irreplaceable as he used to be. So I think this can go one of 2 ways. The break might do him good. He might be able to regain that form. Or we could see him kind of taking over the role that David Beckham did towards the end of his career. A lot of games for England from the bench. I think 2 things are very clear tonight. He's still invaluable to the England team. Gareth Southgate said as much in his media conference tonight. But it's quite clear that his value on the pitch is unquestionably diminishing, for the time being at least.
OK, Steve, thank you very much, Steve, for that. Thank you. And finally, a chess move that is as heartwarming as it is humbling. It is the real-life story and now a Disney film of how a Ugandan street child became a national chess champion. Since Fiona Mutesi first took up the game as a 10-year-old, she's had wins across the board and has become known as the Queen of Katwe, the suburb of Kampala, where she lives.
If you were to go looking for a chess champion, then you would not start here.
Katwe, the biggest slum in the Ugandan capital, Kampala, where children sleep on the roof to avoid drowning in the rainy season, and there's a life expectancy of under 50. It's home to Fiona Matezi, who'd left school aged 6 unable to read or write and was sleeping on the streets at 9. But then she discovered the board game after following her brother to find food just to stay alive.
My brother came and told me about the chess program they used to have. That like after their program, they used to serve them a meal, and that was porridge. And at the street we are just there, like we didn't have anything to eat. Everything was hard for me. So I decided to follow him to get something to eat. So when I went there, that's the first time even I met chess, and that's the way I discovered it.
It's a story that even Hollywood might not have dreamt up.
Young girl, come inside. What is your name?
Fiona met a missionary who had a passion for chess.
Why are you letting her win? I'm not letting her.
Who turned a corn seller into a national champion and more.
She won.
Greatness can be found anywhere and everywhere. She was illiterate, and yet she had this ability with this game that really requires, quite a lot of brain power. You cannot afford to box anyone on the basis of their experience. You have to really look at their potential.
The real-life Robert coached on the film set.
Actually, the clock has to be on your left side because...
And so successful is his chess school that some affluent Ugandans have moved their children to the slum just to be part of it. But it's Fiona and 2 of her friends flourishing that has given him most satisfaction.
The 3 of them represented the country, all from the slums. And they had to hold the national flag. Their first time to the airport, first time to board the plane. So it was, I think, one of the most happiest moments I can really recall.
Having even played former world champion Garry Kasparov, Fiona still believes she will become a chess grandmaster. However, those dreams have already been overtaken. First, she wants to become a lawyer. Richard Pallo, News at 10.
Let's have a look at what's coming up tomorrow then in the news agenda. Well, a report into the death of Bailey Gwynn, the schoolboy stabbed by a fellow pupil at his school in Aberdeen a year ago, is due out in the morning. It will look into whether the authorities knew about his killer's history of violence. There's another milestone in the journey of the driverless car tomorrow. We'll be at a test site in Buckinghamshire to film the latest development, which is a secret apparently until the morning. And Rod Stewart is due at Buckingham Palace, not for a Royal Commander performance, but to collect his knighthood. It was awarded to him in the Queen's birthday honours in June. Lots coming up. Tom will be here tomorrow. He's coming up too, though, shortly with the agenda. His guests tonight are Ken Clark, Clive Anderson, Bonnie Greer and Carol Malone. So do stay with us for all of that. But now, from me and everyone here, good night.